Well, hello everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. Good morning to those of you joining from the States, and good afternoon to those of you joining from Europe, and good evening to those of you who are joining us from Asia. Welcome to today's conference board webcast on zero tolerance company approaches on preventing and responding to harassment at work. My name is Sarah Bond, and I'm the Council Director for the Conference Board's European Diversity and Inclusion Council, which is a peer-to-peer network of diversity and inclusion executives for global companies headquartered in Europe. I'm going to be your moderator and one of the contributors to today's webcast, and I'm really delighted to have you here with us. Before we begin, I just want to go through some practical information about today's session. The first is to give you some ideas about how to make the most of the webcast. We'd really love this to be an interactive session, so please do ask questions as they occur to you in the chat box on your screen, and we'll weave them into the conversation where we can, or follow up with an email afterwards if there's questions we can't answer. Please feel free to download the presentation. There is a short presentation that goes along with this conversation today. There's a file download pod at the bottom center of your screen, so you can access the presentation there. You can full screen the video at any time by clicking on the 4 arrows which are in the top sort of right hand side of your screen. And the final thing to say is that there are continuing education credits being awarded for your participation in this webcast. To be eligible, you need to be logged on for the whole of the webcast, so there's no getting out of it. And to check that you are, you'll be requested to type your name and email in the space provided when it comes up. And finally, of course, we'd ask you to complete the brief evaluation form at the end of the webinar so that we can take account of your feedback and incorporate it into future programs. Actually, not finally, because the other thing we'd love you to do, of course, is if you enjoy what's coming up and you get value out of the conversation, then we'd love you to share the webcast with your colleagues as well. It'll be available on demand through Conference Board website. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn to the topic of today's webinar, which is company approaches to preventing and responding to harassment at work. It's fair to say that we planned this conference some time ago, prior to the coronavirus pandemic. And I know that our panelists as well really wanted very much to go ahead with it because it's such an important issue for us to be talking about as employers and for us to be sharing and addressing approaches on. But at the same time, I've just got to say how much I appreciate you taking the time to join the webinar today. How difficult I know how difficult it can be to focus on anything other than the pandemic at the current time. So I just want to say thank you to participants, and I also want to say thank you to our panelists for today. Now, I'm delighted to have 2 panelists with us today, but as probably like most of you who are listening in today, we're doing this from home and we've actually just lost one of our panelists. So I'm going to start off by introducing Alison Zimmerman, who's the panelist who is online with us at the current time. Alison is Executive Director of Catalyst Europe. And Catalyst is a global not-for-profit that works with corporates to build workplaces that work for women. Alison's responsible for overseeing the organisation's operations in Europe and the Middle East. Working with leading global operations across Europe since 2007, Alison supports corporate members in creating inclusive workplaces where women and all talent can advance. Alison, it's great to have you with us here today.
Great, thank you for having me.
You're welcome. We've also, I've got my fingers very, very firmly crossed that the other panelist is also going to be able to rejoin us any moment now. Hopefully we'll have with us Jennifer Ogle, who's the Global Head of Inclusion and Diversity for Airbus, based in Toulouse. Jennifer's got over 25 years of human resources management experience, and she was formerly head of HR for Airbus Commercial Aircraft Manufacturing in Mobile, Alabama. Now, as I say, all three of us, or at the moment anyway, all two of us are dialing in from home. I'm dialing in from the UK, Alison from Switzerland, and Jennifer from France. So on behalf of all of us, I'd like to apologise for any background noise that might come through on today's webinar. Okay, I'm going to move on, and I'm going to set the context for today's webinar. So this topic is something that is really important to me for employers to address, and I know that Alison and Jennifer also feel similarly. There's plenty of evidence that bullying and harassment remain prevalent issues in workplaces of all kinds, in all sectors, right across the globe. And we know this through multiple research studies, we know it from individual testimony, of course, and we know it from collective movements like Me Too. What we also know is getting an accurate picture of the extent of harassment can be a challenge for reasons that we will talk about later on in the webinar. And I think that sort of explains the range of figures that you see in this slide. So the World Economic Forum says that almost half of women in European countries have experienced unwanted sexual advances, physical contact, or other forms of harassment. According to the TUC, nearly 70% of LGBT people have experienced harassment at work. A quarter of Black and minority ethnic employees have experienced racial bullying or harassment at work. And the CIPD, the UK CIPD, says that 15% of workers across the board have experienced bullying in the last 3 years. 4% say they've been sexually harassed, and 8% experienced other forms of harassment. What we know is that the majority, as I say, of incidents go unreported. We imagine the majority of incidents go unreported. And also what we know is that the experience of harassment has a huge personal impact on the lives of victims and survivors, on workplace culture and engagement, and of course on the retention of staff. And it remains a vital issue for employers to get to grips with in the 21st century, and an issue that has been of real importance, I think, for the Diversity and Inclusion Council to discuss over recent months. Jennifer, it's fabulous to have you back with us. I'm delighted you've been able to rejoin us. I did give a quick introduction in your absence, so great to have you back here with us. So I'm just going to kick off by asking both Alison and Jennifer if you could say just a little bit about why this is such an important issue for you from your different perspectives. And I wonder, Alison, could I ask you if you could kick off, please, with that?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. This topic, it's been around. We heard a lot everywhere. But after the Me Too Time's Up, harassment kind of hit a fever pitch. And it was a topic that at Catalyst, we really needed to explore. In the beginning, in the intro, Sarah, you said workplaces that work for women. We believe that progress for women is progress for everyone. So it's like raising all ships. And what we noticed, however, when we looked at the research out there, we noticed there was not a lot of research to the degree that we had anticipated. We did a white paper based on the research out there, but we could see that the reporting, and when I look at these numbers, I think, this is what we're seeing that's reported. So we don't know what the levels are. So there's definitely a need. There is a need for more emerging research. But for us, when we look at the focus from gender, and I'm just going to align it to harassment and gender, we know that globally, according to the white paper, that 75 to 85% of women were experiencing it. It's not to say men were not, but that was who was reporting it. So when we look deeper, we discover that where there is a disparity of power, where there is an imbalance, when gender parity is not shared at all levels throughout the organization, we saw that there was a correlation to having higher levels of harassment. So this is really telling, it raises questions about power, what that means. And when you look at one statistic, can also look at people with disabilities. are incurring a lot of harassment. So there's a whole other element when you look at power, when you look at privilege. And so we don't believe simply why it matters to us is not simply, have more women at all levels and all harassment will go. No, it's not going to inoculate a company from bad behavior, but it will start to equalize how we see women in the workplace as colleagues, as leaders, and not prey.
Sure.
And that may seem rather
thanks
bold,
for having
but
me,
that's
first of
something
all.
that we do see as a
For
concern.
Airbus, it's
Great,
important
thank
on a
you,
number of
Alison.
fronts.
Hi,
The
Jennifer.
first one I
Could
would
you say a
say
bit about
is,
why
for
this
us,
topic is so important to
harassment is
Airbus?
directly connected to a cultural topic, and it's reflective of a culture in general. And inclusion is very important for us at Airbus. So for me, it's an indicator of where we are in the barometer of inclusion if we have an issue with harassment in the company. It would be ridiculous to say that Airbus doesn't have a problem with harassment because we're normal, like many companies. What we have learned in the past few years is that when you look at harassment and focus on harassment of women, which is typically what tends to be the case because, as Alison said, mostly women report it, we've learned that harassment comes in many forms. And we have decided to approach the harassment not focused on gender, but focused on an overall behavioral attribute that we wish to eradicate from the organization. And we had to learn that the hard way because we had some incidents that we had to investigate that compromised different types of harassment that weren't the traditional ones that at least I had become used to living and working in the U.S. for much of my career. But it was an important lesson for Airbus to learn that harassment comes in many forms and it's not always appropriated to gender. So that really forced us to think differently about the topic.
Yeah, that's a great segue actually into the next the next question, or actually the next sort of piece of setup, if you like, for this conversation, which is around, well, what do we actually mean when we talk about harassment? So the EU definition for harassment is up there on the screen. Defines it as unwanted conduct, bullying, or other behaviour that has the purpose of creating an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating, or offensive environment. And actually, the UK's Chartered Institute of Personnel Development, CIPD, identifies the three most common forms of bullying behaviour, if you like, Jennifer, to what you were just talking about, as being undermined and humiliated, as unwanted criticism, and unwanted personal remarks. And again, I wanted to ask both of you, if I could, to what extent does that sort of definition and those kinds of behaviours work for you? What do you see as sort of challenges, I suppose, for employers when it comes to defining what is or isn't harassment? Can I ask maybe Jennifer, you to kick off with that?
About how you do define harassment, and it's really behavioral, and it's closely linked to cultural attributes of an organization and what we aspire to from an inclusivity point of view. And what we have learned is we have approached it as an overall indicator of a key cultural attribute we have in the company called Speak Up. And as we will talk throughout the webinar about how we track harassment cases and how we view that and how we indicate that, for us, having a culture where people feel that they can speak up around behavior that they're uncomfortable about is very important. But it's more important to be consistent about how we manage these situations, how we handle discipline if discipline is involved, and how we have as consistent a definition as you possibly can, because in a large, complex organization where you have multiple working environments, a corporate infrastructure versus a shop floor manufacturing environment, you will find that people define what's acceptable differently. But if you have an overarching understanding of what's okay from a company values perspective and behaviors and attributes perspective, then it's easier to be consistent. So that was a very important learning for us, and that's how we try to apply our code of conduct and our values in the company.
Great, thanks. Alison, anything you want to add in terms of definitions?
Yeah, just really brief. I mean, I like what Jennifer just shared. It's really about sometimes understanding what it isn't can be helpful of understanding what harassment is. So not being afraid to spell it out, not being afraid to define it. And also the cultural point, it can be in one culture defined as harassment and another not, according to the cultural norms. So for companies, it's really important that they have their culture norms within a culture, regardless of where they are. And I remember, once hearing somebody tell me that the most helpful training was hearing what it wasn't, because there's so much fear around this. And so kind of getting really clear on what you're saying is really crucial. So, yeah.
Okay. And maybe also people listening in, do put some questions in the chat if you've got any comments about what we're saying here, or any thoughts yourself about definitions. I'm going to move on now to sort of the substantive content of the webinar and turn to what employers are doing to prevent and respond to bullying and harassment at work. And in what follows, Alison and Jennifer and I are going to cover off a number of themes. And for each theme, what we're going to do is I'm going to take as our starting point some data that we gathered within Conference Board when we did a small-scale benchmarking survey recently of employers on the back of a discussion which we had at the Diversity and Inclusion Council in September about, what are employers doing when it comes to preventing and responding to bullying and harassment. 23 employers participated in the survey. So I do want to caution, it is a small-scale survey, but I think the results are useful and will give some insight for you into what companies are doing, and Alison and Jennifer and I will talk around these. So we're going to look at 5 areas in the next 20 minutes or so. We're going to look at strategy and leadership, so we'll kick off with that, and policy around bullying and harassment. We're going to look at risk, identification of risk. We're going to look at awareness raising. We're going to look at reporting and responding, and we're going to look at learning, so organisational learning. So those 5 areas. The first discussion point that we're going to kick off with is around strategy and leadership. And what our survey found when we spoke to these 23 companies was that the vast majority, almost everyone, 91% of companies, agreed that their leadership had made a clear commitment to eliminating harassment and bullying at work. So it's, harassment and bullying is clearly on the agenda of leaders at this time. So a really big tick there. What we found also, which was really interesting, was that despite harassment and bullying being on the agenda of leaders, actually fewer companies were then able to say, or were then agreed that they had a policy for eliminating harassment and bullying at work, and a strategy or plan determining the approach that they were going to take to harassment and bullying at work. So both some really interesting data there, I think, both about the extent of leadership commitment and perhaps a bit of a gap then between how and whether that leadership commitment then translates into action. So I wanted to ask maybe Jennifer, first of all. I know Airbus has got a
Yes,
policy
so the
around
policy itself
harassment and
is
bullying. I wonder
really
if you could
linked
talk a
to our
bit,
code of conduct,
bearing in mind what we're going to
which
cover
we
later
had a
on, but if
code
you
of
talk a bit in
conduct
sort
in
of top
place,
level
but we
about
knew that
what Airbus's
it
policy
needed to
covers.
be refreshed and strengthened to really focus on the topics around ethical and compliant behavior. And to make sure employees understood their responsibilities as well as what the company's responsibilities and accountabilities were. We also, I think, strengthened our policy after going through some experiences with cases and through the investigation of cases and realizing that we needed to strengthen the link between our values, the code of conduct, and culturally where we wanted to be in terms of an inclusive culture and workplace. So I would say my experience has been, just as a disclaimer, mostly working in the U.S. until the last 3 years. And I think that companies that are headquartered in the U.S. and that have strong North American roots have been dealing with this subject for many, many years due to the laws that are in place. And perhaps in Europe, it has not been that big of a focus in the last years. But, you know, Airbus itself came about our our discrimination policy through knowing that we wanted to do something different in terms of strengthening our code of conduct, but also using the experiences we've been through with some harassment cases that were, you know, frankly, eye-opening to the leadership in the organization. And we made a specific, I think, effort at connecting ethics and compliance to the topic of discrimination and harassment, and also making the implicit link between inclusion and diversity and harassment, because it's not always obvious for people, but we believe that there's a strong link between inclusion and harassment when it comes to culture. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Okay, so that's really interesting. So links with the code of conduct, with values, and with inclusion, connect a policy framework that connects all of those three things together. Yeah, great, thank you. So Alison, I mean, I know that Catalyst has got a really interesting model actually, describing four components of an organization's strategy around bullying and harassment. I'll just put the slide up which has these four areas. And I wonder if you could just talk through this again at a top level. I think it would be interesting for people who are listening who are thinking, well, what might our policy or our strategy cover? If you could just briefly talk through those four areas. Thanks very much.
Yeah, absolutely. And this came from a lot of stuff out there that our researchers looked, and they created a white paper on what they felt based on what we see, what is important to have. First of all, prepare. The top level of this is just take a look at your policies, absolutely update them. Update them now, not before you need it. That's so crucial, because oftentimes we've discovered there's a gap in the policy when something happens. But to be kind of focused now, make it absolutely clear that everybody has a responsibility. And this really ties to leadership as well, that they're walking the talk, that they're holding any policy around bullying and harassment, that they are fully supporting them. And one quote I'll just say briefly is a CEO from Carnival, Arnold Donald. He, after the Me Too movement, he made this quote and he said, "You set the standard by the things you ignore." So really getting real about what is the situation, owning it, knowing nobody has it perfect, nobody, but get real about it and don't ignore it, because, this is key. I promised to be brief, Sarah, so I'll go briefly through the other three.
Thank you, Alison.
Yeah. Prevent is just be crystal clear, spell it out. Don't assume anything that people know what it means. There are certain, definitions under there. And then respond is just take it serious and act. So act upon it, research, look into it. And transform goes to the point, I want to highlight what Jennifer said, is about making inclusion being that link. And inclusion is really important. Be inclusive. Some focus on making respect a core value. And respect is directly tied to this inclusive, safe and fair workplace. That's the short version.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. So, I mean, I think just as takeaways for people on the call, I mean, I think that these four actions do provide a framework if you're thinking about what should a strategy or an action plan comprise at a top level, and hopefully the headings, the sort of topics that we're covering in this webinar as well. So whether that's leadership, risk assessment, etc., raising awareness, that they will also provide you with some, again, a sort of framing that you could use as you're developing a policy. What I was curious to do now was actually to ask people who are on the call about your own organisations, and we've actually got a poll for you. So we're going to ask you 3 questions, which I hope will come up. Let me just see. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. I hope that the poll's going to come up in a minute. There you go. It should be on your screen now. There are 3 questions for you there. The first is, has the leadership of your organisation made a clear commitment to eliminating harassment and bullying at work?
Okay.
So we see 73%, around 70%, saying that the leadership has made a clear commitment to eliminating harassment and bullying at work. Around 17 to 18% saying it hasn't, and just over 10% saying they don't know. And then actually a kind of slightly different pattern, which is really interesting actually from the pattern that we saw in our survey. Very similar proportions saying that their organisations, or your organisations, those of you who are listening in, your organisations do have a zero tolerance policy aimed at eliminating harassment and bullying at work. And similar numbers, in fact even more, saying your organisation has a strategy or a plan for implementing the policy at work. So what I'm seeing here, compared to what the data that we gathered, is that actually the highest response rate is in relation to organisations having a strategy or a plan.
Sarah, if I might,
and then
I'd like
very
to comment
similar
on that. Could I?
Numbers responding that your the leadership of your organisation
comment I
has
would
made a clear
make is
commitment
what's
to
interesting to
eliminating
me is the
harassment,
first
and your
question, which is
organisation has a zero
the
tolerance
leadership
policy.
of the organization committing to
Great,
eliminating
thanks.
harassment. That's a different level
Please
than just
do,
putting in a
absolutely. Yes,
policy or
please do.
implementing a policy. And so what that says to me is that, some companies may have said, okay, we have a policy in place, but what's the next step? The next step is demonstrating the commitment through consequential management, walking the walk, and doing some of those things, which has been, again, I think a reflection of companies like Airbus and where we've been in terms of really trying to assess. We have a policy in place, yet we still have elements in our culture that we believe are unhealthy. What's the gap and how do we address it?
Great, thank you. Thanks very much, Jennifer. Alison, I don't know if you could see, there is a question for you there around sexual harassment. I'm wondering if we could sort of weave the response to that in as we go along. If you're able to just keep that question in mind. Thank you, Kerry, for sharing your question with us. Okay. So the next thing we wanted to turn to was around risk identification. And one of the companies that in the survey, when we asked, what are you doing to prevent and respond to harassment, We asked companies whether they'd actually conducted a risk assessment in order to better target strategies, policies, and plans. And what we found was that 43% of companies had actually conducted a risk assessment, so fewer than half. Now, the Equality and Human Rights Commission in the UK talks in its guidance, it's got some very good guidance, by the way, about employer approaches on harassment and bullying. It talks about the importance of conducting a risk assessment, and it names a number of factors. I mean, Alison has already talked about one, which is imbalances of power. But the EHRC guidance also identifies factors like lone working, the presence of alcohol, and a lack of diversity in the workforce as also being risk factors around bullying and harassment at work. I'm wondering, Alison, is there anything else, from Catalyst's perspective that in your white paper or other sources that you would recommend that companies include in their risk assessments?
Sometimes when we're often talking about harassment or any issue that is bubbling under the surface in the culture, we want to assess what is the psychological safety in the organization. And that level of psychological safety can be simply being able to speak up or not speak up. So checking in to see where are you there on the spectrum of inclusion, how psychologically safe do you have? But thinking of the white paper, what channels do you have available where people can report? How is it handled? Do you have anonymous channels? I mean, this might be coming in a future question.
Yeah, we will come on to that, definitely, yeah.
So, but another thing, in thinking of risk, some companies, especially, when alcohol is involved, is often a risk, like having alcohol at an event. I remember one leader saying 100% of their harassment cases usually involve some form of alcohol. And our point of view is you want to assess, it's not about not having alcohol, but you do want to assess where and what is being reported and look and see how safe is it for people to speak up? Do you see a pattern? And if you see a pattern, how are you addressing it?
I would certainly agree that I think an organization that
thank you, Alison. Jennifer, what about
gender balanced
from your perspective? What do you see as the factors that contribute
it will be an
organization
chock full of harassment, but certainly I think there's a risk there. I believe that there's a very strong link to culture again. I think that if you have an inclusive culture or you have an aspirational inclusive culture that capitalizes on all differences, not just gender, but nationality, education, orientation, etc., then we are mitigating risk there. So I think there's a strong link to culture. And again, I think if an organization has a very strong values proposition in place and the organization leans on the values and what they live every day, how people are treated, how leaders lead, what's important, and how people are valued in the organization, this will transcend, and this can reduce risk as well. I would say not only in Airbus's case, but in many companies' cases, risk assessments are often conducted after you have enough information to tell you that you need to review the risk in the organization and determine how to mitigate it. And that's typically how harassment cases work. So we're no different. We now track all of our cases. As I stated before, we believe it's an indication of speak up. So we actually, not that we want to see harassment going on in the organization, but when people are speaking up and talking about behavior that they thought was not in line with our values, or if they were a victim to some type of harassment, we see that as a positive sign of speak up in our culture. So we want to track that. We want to make sure that this is an open way of people being able to share their experience, and we have a variety of ways of doing that, and I think we'll talk about that in just a minute or two. Definitely, yes. As we talked about before, Sarah, offline, that
Yeah, great.
we
Thank
do
you,
an
Jennifer.
annual,
And am I right in
now
thinking that
annual engagement
it's also
survey, and a big
something
part
that
of
you
that
cover off
is
in your
respect,
engagement survey as well, in your people
and
survey?
leadership, and
Yeah.
inclusion, in terms of how the person feels included in the organization and how they view the company's perspective on inclusion and diversity. So we see all those linked to the topic of inclusion and safety at work, and we try to define safety at work as broader than just the kind of occupational safety, but it's people's ability to feel safe, comfortable to speak up, that they work in an environment where they feel respected.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. So listen, let's dig a bit more then. Let's dig a bit more deeply into what companies are actually doing around prevention. And I'm going to kick off with questions about raising awareness. As we discussed these, Alison and Jennifer, I wonder if you could bear in mind the question that Tongi has just put, which is around, are strategies that are mentioned applicable globally across all countries? So it'd be great if you could bear that question in mind. And I can see Tongi's just posted another question about, do you go public with cases identified? We'll come back to that when we look at organisational learning, maybe. So for the moment, when we're talking about raising awareness, let's try and think about global scope. So what did the survey found when we asked companies about raising awareness? Again, the vast majority of companies responding to this survey said that they did provide training aimed at preventing harassment and bullying at work, and it's a fairly consistent pattern that they were doing this, and also that similar numbers make the training mandatory. So that was very clear. We asked about dedicated training, so as opposed to training that was integrated into other training, but a large number of companies also responded that they integrated their training into other training, for instance, like management and leadership development. And what we found is that training is targeted equally at leaders, managers and staff. So it's not only a leadership and management issue, it is around raising awareness for staff in general. And it's not only a staff issue. Clearly there's some aspect of raising awareness around bullying and harassment, which is targeted specifically at leaders and managers. Jennifer, tell me about what Airbus does when it comes to raising awareness around bullying and harassment, and in particular around developing the kinds of behaviours
that we have for our leaders, and we
that
have
sort of leaders and managers might be expected to adopt in order to respond and prevent and respond to bullying and harassment.
For all leaders in the organization. And there are key traits and attributes associated with this leadership model around respect, around inclusion, around diversity, around leading by example, around open communication, etc. And so I think it starts there. When you look at any organization, be it Airbus or any other, it's very important to see how clear are the expectations for leaders and managers around how they are supposed to behave. And our values are woven into the leadership model. So it's what I think works well for us in our organization is that the values in the leadership model are integral and they're integrated. So it starts there. It doesn't, a leadership model doesn't prevent, inappropriate behavior. It doesn't prevent harassment. But it does start with a common expectation around how managers and leaders are expected to behave. One thing we do that I referenced before is we track all of our ethics and compliance harassment cases because we see it as a measure of speak up, but also it's to make sure we're being consistent in the application of consequential management and also looking for trends. And this gets tracked and discussed at the executive committee level with the CEO of the company and his direct reports. And it's integrated into the work I do with my governance as head of inclusion and diversity for the company. So it's a very important indicator for us as to, again, do we have an open culture where people have a way to report something that they don't think is right? So we have a confidential open line that any employee, subcontractor, temporary employee can use. We have the normal means of reporting by going to the manager, the HR business partner, etc. And we track all of those throughout the world. We do it globally and we do it consistently. And people ask me the question all the time, so what is your measure of success? If your incidents reported is going up year on year, why is that good? And again, it's the lens through which you look. If you're looking through the lens of we want to be able to see whether our means of reporting and whether people speaking up is improving, then we should see the number of incidents reported going up. It may not mean that every incident is a harassment case. That would take deeper analysis. But if we see the reports going up, then we know that people are feeling comfortable to speak up, and we see that as a positive thing. I also believe that the concerted effort we've made to improve the communication of and clarify the code of conduct in the company, to reissue it, to make it more clear and direct around behaviors that are and are not tolerated in the company, to link it to our values, and to have a very strong connection to our inclusion and diversity ambition in the company speaks volumes about the importance of making sure we have an inclusive and safe an open workplace for our employees.
Thanks, Jennifer, for that. I mean, you talked about reporting and responding, and to go back to the survey, this was something that we asked employers about, and what we found is exactly what you said, that employers tend, offer a range of different reporting mechanisms, be it informal or formal, always confidential, always the option for anonymous reporting. Most of the reporting happens through HR, through the HR function, through managers, or through a hotline. So lots of references to hotlines from the companies that we surveyed. And we also asked about support for victims or survivors of bullying and harassment afterwards, and 84% of companies said they provide support for victims of harassment. The question that sort of sticks with me around reporting and responding is that, as we said right at the beginning, a lot of cases do go unreported, and we know from elsewhere, so not from our survey, but we know from elsewhere that there are lots of reasons for this. And these include concerns about confidentiality. So how confidential will it be if I report? Not wanting to be seen as a troublemaker. I mean, I think that's a troublemaker in inverted commas. That's a very strong deterrent. Worried about repercussions, particularly in terms of career. What's going to be the impact on my career if I report? Skepticism about whether it makes any difference or not. So I'm going to put myself out there on the line. Is this actually going to make any difference? Barriers to report, sort of cultural and social barriers to reporting. I hear about Airbus's speak up culture, and in other organisations there may not be such a kind of culture. It's not, it's that if that doesn't exist, that itself is a barrier. And then also, of course, reporting mechanisms may not be adequately communicated. People may not even know that those communication mechanisms exist. Alison, I wonder if you've got anything to say either about what Catalyst sees as good practice around reporting, or about what you see as some of the barriers to reporting.
Yeah, so first of all, reporting is really in the prevent part of our white paper. We highlight that there are multiple channels for reporting. You need to have those anonymous channels. You need to, because oftentimes people don't want to be seen, as you said, like the troublemaker, which even that word, caution.
It feels uncomfortable. Yeah.
Yeah, but think about it. Think, you don't want to rock the boat. Think of all the words we use. Why people aren't coming forward is directly linked to how safe they feel. If they come forward, will they have repercussions? And so in terms of reporting, we say multiple channels, have an anonymous email line, an anonymous phone line, a tip line. What we know is that when people come forward, they often leave the organization within a short amount of time after they've come forward. And many times they are not believed, or there will be the statement that, oh, it couldn't have been true, it's not true, it was proven false. It's quite a broad statement, and there have been studies that show harassment, even, this isn't only on gender, but even amongst the genders, there isn't agreement on what is harassment. And so I want to go to Carrie's point. I don't want to lose this point because she asked the question. She asked a question about, sexual harassment and what other additional support do you need when you go there. And I'm thinking about reporting. First of all, you need that safe line, that safe space, that channel that they can come forward and not face repercussions. When you have that, then they can come forward. You also need impartial investigation process.
Yeah.
And if you don't have that impartial investigation process, who's looking at will be looking at it through their lens. And then finally, the biggest thing in terms of, I want to go back to what was said about awareness, is companies are not going to be tried through HR in the normal process. This is not to tap into fears. They're going to be tried through social media if there is something. And you can think of companies. So it's in the interest that the policy kicks it off and leadership is on board. But every individual in the organization has buy-in into this in some way, shape, or form, whatever brings them to the table. And sexual harassment, bullying, harassment, all of this is on a spectrum. And so simply having something come up does not mean guilt. And so that has to be communicated. But it also recognizing that there's a broad description and there's a lot of fear involved, why people don't come forward. Or if somebody comes forward, how dare, am I guilty of sexual harassment, or am I guilty of bullying? When you define it and really respond accordingly to what the accusation is, the response has to match the accusation. So it can't be that if something happens here, the response doesn't match it. It can cause a lot of, I would say it can cause a lot of fear. It can cause a lot of angst in the organization. And so the more clarity you have, the more defined you have, the easier it will be to talk about it. And I think we lost Jennifer, and I was going to add a point about
I just wondered, Alison, if you could talk a bit about bystander, by the use of bystanders as well. That would be brilliant.
Yeah, I wanted to mention that because bystander intervention, it takes everybody. And if you think of leadership from every seat, so you want to empower everybody to speak up. And I remember not that long ago, I was in a meeting with a CEO and the head of HR in, I won't say the country, I live in Europe, but I remember we were there to talk about a different issue. And I remember the HR came in and said, we have an issue here right now. We have a sexual harassment case with one of your top leaders. And I remember that the executive's response, the CEO, he looked at me and he said, it's not true. It's not true. Immediately, without any information. And I looked at him and I said, how do you know? How do you know? And then I asked the HR, I said, who came forward? Was it a man or a woman? And he said it was a man coming forward. So we automatically make assumptions. Why I tell this story is the man was coming forward on behalf of 3 women who were experiencing it. And he had enough. He was seeing it, but the 3 women did not feel safe. Now, this case was sexual harassment. This isn't, bullying. This was clearly connected. The power of individuals coming forward on behalf of other individuals is where we need to go in many corporations and organizations, is to empower the individual to step forward and say, hey, I'm seeing something, or calling out your colleague and saying to your colleague, have a conversation, say, I think you crossed the line here. If it's, and I'll give you an example. A leader, a country leader shared this story. He was out with a group, a team, a sales team, and he saw one man speaking with one of the women consultants, rather friendly. And they were 1 drink into the cocktail hour, and he was watching this behavior, and he got up and he said, hey, I'll call him Joe. And this was in Europe. And he said, come over here. But the leader had gone and ordered a cab. He knew something was wrong. He got him a cab and he said, Joe, I'll explain tomorrow, but you're about 10 minutes away from a problem. And I'm just intervening. You haven't done anything wrong. Don't panic. But why don't you go home and let's talk about it tomorrow with your manager. Next day, the conversation had, and it appeared that there was a medication problem that created some behavior that, it's no excuse, who knows. But they managed it and handled it. Nobody lost their job. It was about recognizing, whoa, I'm hearing more and more people doing this. And this gives me heart for this topic. It really does.
Yes, can you guys hear me?
We need those personal interventions, not only policy. And this is something globally.
I went to a different computer, so sorry.
Thank you, Alison. Jennifer, great to have you back with us. Can you hear us? We can hear you perfectly. Thank you. We were just talking about bystanders.
Definitely, bystanders is a very important topic that we.
No worries at all. We were just talking about the use of bystanders in reporting and responding to harassment and bullying. Is that something that Airbus has done any work on?
Bystanders when it comes to anti-harassment, and it's very important to bring awareness and education to our employees, and also I will say we use our employee resource group platforms of volunteers to make sure they're educated on the topic of bystanders as well, and the importance of bystanders to acknowledge these behavioral issues that they may see, and making sure they understand that we are promoting safety in the culture, and that there is a speak up accountability for each and every employee.
Great, thank you. So listen, I'm just going to move on to the last section, which is around organisational learning. And what we found from the survey was that almost all companies said they use the information from the allegations of harassment and bullying to inform policy, practice and behaviour for the future. And I was wondering if either of you could share how your organisation uses the learning from cases in order to shift behaviour for the future. And maybe bearing in mind back to Tongi's question, which is around, how public do you go with the cases in order to, again, I guess, to sort of maximise the learning opportunities from those cases. I mean, there's a lot more besides learning opportunities, of course, that matters, but just for this point,
as it does not compromise
Jennifer, what's your thoughts?
The confidentiality of the people involved and the integrity of the investigations and any consequential management decisions that have to be made. We've decided some of the best way to increase awareness and increase the learning about what is and is not acceptable behavior when it comes to harassment is by educating our population about incidents that have been investigated. So we must do it in a way that's safe and protective and in an inclusive manner. And we have found that by sharing that type of information, giving some examples through our ethics and compliance teams, our colleagues there, through giving examples to the organization, we've really started a conversation in the organization around what is and is not okay and learnings. And frankly, leaders and managers are still very fearful on this topic. They aren't sure how to handle the situation. They want to ensure that consistent application of consequential management happens. So we found that talking about it helps to reduce the anxiety around the topic. In terms of making it public outside the company, it's not something we put in our annual report or anything like that, but we do talk about our code of conduct, and that's very public. And we, we talk about the values and how that's an important core and a pillar of our organization behavior and leadership expectations. So that's how we handle it inside the organization, and I think it's proven to be very helpful in Europe, in the European context. Again, I have a personal opinion, it's my personal opinion, that in other countries, the topic is a little bit more advanced and probably less difficult to discuss, frankly, with managers and leaders, but that's not always the case. And then again, when you talk about a multicultural, multinational organization that's global and has a global footprint, it becomes even more challenging, because you have to understand what could be acceptable in one country isn't acceptable in another, which is why at Airbus we have chosen to really ground our values into our ethics and compliance mindset and our code of conduct. And that's how it all kind of surrounds the topic of harassment and how it's dealt with.
Great, thank you so much, Jennifer. And I'm afraid we're pretty much out of time now on this webinar, but I did want to share with you some of the resources that Conference Board or itself and the Diversity Inclusion Council had used itself in putting together the report and the survey, so that these may be of interest to people who are on the call. I want to say a massive thanks to both Jennifer and to Alison for joining us here today. I've really appreciated the conversation with you both, and thanks so much for sharing. I feel like there's loads we could have talked about and gone into much more depth on, but thank you for that. And to those of you who are listening in, if you're interested to know more, indeed if you want to join the European Diversity and Inclusion in Business Council, then please do get in touch with the Conference Board. It really is a great place to have conversations around and exchange insights with other people who are leading on diversity and inclusion in their organisations. As I said at the beginning, we'd love it if you could kindly take a moment to fill out the evaluation form at the end, so we can continue to bring you the best quality webcast that we possibly can. And also let me just remind you that there's a recording of the webcast which will be available from Conference Board to download within the next 24 hours. So finally, I think it just remains for me to say stay well, stay safe, stay healthy, and thank you all very much indeed. Thanks. Bye-bye.